So open up to the book of Matthew chapter 4. We are studying the temptation of Jesus. If you haven't read this, I would like for you to read it first. So read Matthew chapter 4 verses 1 through 11 that covers the temptation of Jesus. You can stop this video and come right back after you have read it. Good. All right. So Matthew chapter 4. Before we even get into talking about the temptation of Jesus, I want us to look at 1 John 2:16. So if you're taking notes, you can write down 1 John 2:16, and it says, "For all that is in the world, the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life, is not of the Father, but of the world." That verse is very important because we are going to see how the lust of the flesh, the lust of the eyes, and the pride of life is seen in the temptation of Jesus. So let's look at Matthew chapter 4, verse 1. "Then Jesus was led up by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil." So immediately, let's stop right here and let's look at context. What happened before we got to Matthew chapter 4? Well, before Matthew chapter 4, in chapter 3, we find the baptism of Jesus. Jesus was just baptized, and this temptation came right after Jesus was baptized. So, great moment in Jesus's life, big moment in his life, and now he's led by the Spirit into the wilderness to be tempted by the devil. And I think in our lives, we know so often there are really big moments, and usually big moments, happy moments, are followed with moments of attack, right? Because we are in this world where there is an enemy that has come to steal, kill, and destroy. So even the great moments that we experience in our life, there is an enemy that wants to steal that. Steal our peace, steal our joy, steal our happiness, right, in the Lord. And this is something that we see even in this passage. Another thing that I would stop to realize here is that the Spirit led Jesus into the wilderness to be tempted, right? So this was something orchestrated, right, by the Spirit of God, where it led him to the wilderness. Have you ever felt like led by God into whatever trial you're facing or whatever test and circumstance you're in? So Jesus was led by the Spirit into the wilderness. Now, wilderness is something that's very important here, and it should jump out at you. When we look at the wilderness and what that means and symbolizes throughout the Bible, you will find many different things, right? When it comes to the wilderness, right, can be a place of testing. So if we look at Deuteronomy 8:2, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years to humble and test you in order to know what was in your heart, whether or not you would keep his commands." So one thing we immediately see, the wilderness in this setting, God used it to humble and test his people to see what was in their heart and if they would keep his commands. So the wilderness in our lives could be a place of testing. It could also be a place of encounter. In Exodus chapter 3, verses 1 through 6, we see Moses encounters God in a wilderness, right? So this is a great moment for Moses and a transformative moment for Moses, and it took place in the wilderness, right? The wilderness is a place of preparation, not punishment. So when we look at the word, right, different moments of people who encountered wilderness, right, the wilderness in their lives, this is where God would test them, teach them, meet them. And the wilderness in our life is where God tests us, teaches us, strips us, meets us, prepares us before he sends us. And we see that in this passage with Jesus. Jesus is about to be tempted. He has just been baptized. He's now going to the wilderness to be tempted by the devil before he really launches and sets off in his ministry. Let's look at verse 2. "After he had fasted 40 days and 40 nights, he was hungry. So Jesus is fasting. He is hungry. 40 days and 40 nights, right? Some of us have fasted before, hopefully, and we know that this is a sacrifice. We know the difficulty that comes with fasting, and Jesus is in a moment where he is fasting, right? So think of Jesus being 100% God, 100% man. He knows what it is to hunger. He knows what it is to thirst. He knows what it is to live this life except without sin. So in this moment, Jesus is probably feeling a little weak, probably feeling hungry, probably feeling like he's just can't wait for his next meal. So in our life, when we look at this, right, we all hunger for something. We all have cravings. We all have an appetite. And the question is, what do we fill ourselves with, right? In moments of temptation, temptation doesn't always hit us when we are strong. Temptation will hit us when we are weak. We see here Jesus having a vulnerable, weak moment, and the enemy comes to tempt him. So we can expect in our lives, right, if this happened to Jesus, it's surely going to happen to us, right, where we will have weak moments where the enemy will tempt us to fill our lives with things that are not meant to satisfy us, right? So if we look at verse 3 says, the tempter came to him and said, if you are the Son of God, tell these stones to become bread. So here, right, Satan is coming to Jesus and saying, if you are the Son of God. This is attacking identity, right? And the enemy loves to attack our identity. But what's so interesting when you look at context, remember, in studying the Bible, we look at context. In Matthew chapter 3, we see that Jesus was baptized, right? And if you look in Matthew chapter 3, in verse 17, right, 16 and 17, when Jesus was baptized, he went up immediately from the water. The heavens suddenly opened for him, and he saw the Spirit of God descending like a dove and coming down on him. And a voice from heaven said, this is my beloved Son, with whom I am well pleased. God has just finished affirming Jesus as being his son, saying, this is my beloved Son. And a few verses later in the next chapter, the devil is telling Jesus, if you are the Son of God. I find it so interesting how God affirms and the enemy tries to distract. God affirms and confirms and the enemy tries to take that away. And he will do that with us so many times. He will try time and time again to get us to confuse who we are and what God has called us to do. In 1 John 2:16, like we read earlier, we saw that one of the temptations we see is the lust of the flesh. And we see this in real time in this passage. The idea of feeding yourself. Satan telling Jesus, turn these stones to bread. Could Jesus have turned the stones to bread? Absolutely. Is Jesus physically hungry after fasting 40 days? Absolutely. So Satan tempts Jesus, right, in order to satisfy him, right, satisfy his legitimate need. So he's hungry legitimately, right? He's physically hungry in an illegitimate way, in a way that is not pleasing to God. This is the lust of the flesh, a craving, a physical satisfaction, right? Or craving, desire that is outside of God's timing and outside of God's will. When we look at this, is bread a bad thing? No. Is food a bad thing? No. The problem here is that Jesus was fasting. So there wasn't a problem with the bread, right? It wasn't a problem with if Jesus could do this or not. It was a problem because Jesus was in a moment of obedience to his Father. Could he have eaten the bread? Could he have turned the stones to bread? Absolutely. So a lot of times there's nothing wrong with the things that Satan may tempt us with, right? Because if we look at it, we need people, we need friends, we need, right, certain things in life. We need food, okay? but Satan will distort that which we need. So it's not that friends, it's the type of friends he may bring to you, the type of influence they may have on you. It's not, the people around you, it's how those people affect you. So when we look at this passage, it was a legitimate need, but it was trying, right? The enemy was trying for Jesus to satisfy that need in an illegitimate way.